an update from the Consensus Building Institute, the organization that my colleague Mariana and I are a part of, and who are here under contract to be your facilitators. And then we'll go ahead and check in with you about how this media experience has been. We appreciate your endurance all of these months dealing with meeting online, and it's also always important for us to understand how we can make this experience better for you, given its constraints. Okay, going back to the top of the agenda, if we could start with some introductions of the BAB members, and so. I'll just call you your organization by name, and you can introduce who your BAB member is. So Western Canal Water District.
Greg Johnson, present. A board member and or director.
Thank you, Greg. Good to have you here. Biggs West Gridley Water District.
Cheryl Gordon, board member of the advisory board, not of the water district board, and a landowner.
Thank you, Cheryl. Nice to have you here. City of Biggs.
Bo Shepherd, Big City Council. And Mark Sorensen's also here.
Great. Thank you, Bo. Nice to have you here. Peter, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Peter Ruggiero.
Butte Water District, board member of Butte Water District.
Thanks, Peter. And Richvale Irrigation District.
Yes, Gary Stone, board member of the district, yes.
Thank you, Gary. Butte County.
Yeah, Todd Kimmelshoe, County Supervisor.
Welcome, Todd. Nice to have you here.
I'm the alternate. Supervisor Deborah Luceron. I'm the alternate for the board.
Thank you, Deborah, and welcome. The Colusa County. I'm sorry, the CGA, Colusa Groundwater Authority. Mary, do we have a representative? Oh. Yeah, go ahead. Colusa Groundwater Authority representative.
Tanya, neither of our representatives is available today.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Thank you for confirming. And Glenn County, Lisa.
Grant Carmen, Glenn County Board of Supervisors.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much. And the city of Gridley.
Yeah, Mike Farr. I'm here with, I'm part of the city council in Gridley, and I'm in the chambers with the city of Biggs.
Thank you, Mike Farr. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, the participant list does jump around a little bit. Did I miss any of the BAB, the Butte Advisory Board members? Okay, thank you all, and welcome to members of the public who've joined us today for the advisory board meeting. Let's go to public comment. Again, these are for items that aren't currently agendized today, but that are relevant to the work of the Butte Advisory Board. Are there any public comments? Go ahead and raise your hand, please, and I'll go ahead and call upon you. Jim Brobeck.
Thank you, Tanya. I would like to make a comment about artificial recharge projects. The idea for a recharge project is to pump groundwater faster than nature refills it, and then to try to temporarily replace lost groundwater with surplus water, and then sell the recharge water. The economics of the project depend on creating storage space by removing water through excessive groundwater mining. If there were no adverse consequences, this kind of water mining would then perhaps exercising the North Sac Valley aquifer system might make sense. But there are adverse consequences for other humans and the local environment. Recharged water is governed by surface water rights and is not subject to traditional groundwater laws regarding groundwater. This indicates the potential for surface water diverters to aggressively exercise the aquifer and sell and transfer water without regard to Butte County's export ordinance. Water purveyors with land outside of Butte County are planning to engage in groundwater substitution water sales, so interbasin coordination must include discussions on aquifer privatization. I recommend that the Butte Subbasin Board and Advisory Committee study the document titled Legal Implications of Potential Projects and Management Actions that's been produced at the insistence of the VINA Stakeholder Advisory Committee. This white paper clearly explains that project proponents gain water rights over recharged water. And that document, I believe, is available in the VINA GSA site. Perhaps staff could correct me if I'm wrong on that. Thanks for taking my comment, Tanya.
Thank you, Jim. And we can, of course, reference that forwarded document to all of the GSAs. There are 11 groundwater sustainability agencies in the Butte Subbasin, and we can make sure that they have that document and then can make the determination about whether they would like to agendize it for future meetings. Thank you, Jim, for bringing that to the BAB's attention. Are there other public comments for items not on today's agenda? Okay. Did you, Alfred, you seem to have gone off mute. Did you have a comment that you'd like to make?
Oh, no, not at this time, no.
Okay, just so you know, you went off mute there.
I didn't do anything. I just walked around a little bit.
Okay, you can go ahead and mute your phone so that we don't hear that background noise, and then I won't bug you again. Okay.
Well, unmute is *6, or what is mute?
Well, you can actually manually mute your phone. You can hit *6, and that will mute and unmute you. So you can hit *6, it will mute you, and you hit *6 again, and it'll unmute you. It's like a toggle on, toggle off. Okay.
Oh, I got you.
Great. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead, and I'd like to pass it off to Kelly Peterson, who will be making a presentation to the BAB on groundwater dependent ecosystems. Go ahead, Kelly.
Hi, thank you, Tanya. This is Kelly Peterson from Butte County. I'm the water resources scientist there. Can everybody hear me okay and see my screen all right?
Yes, it looks great.
Thank you so much. So today, I know we don't have a whole lot of time to go through this, so I'm gonna just hit some of the highlights here and give a brief background on what groundwater dependent ecosystems are and how they relate to SGMA, and some of the work that we've been doing most recently. And I'll try to leave a little bit of time there at the end for any questions. But in general, we refer to them as GDEs. I know it's a big acronym world out there, but GDEs are basically ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or on the groundwater occurring near the ground surface. And so, in essence, it's an ecosystem that is dependent and it wouldn't survive otherwise, but for the fact that there's groundwater helping it to survive. And so, just give you some quick examples of what a GDE actually is. If you think about the wetlands that we have, rivers, streams, those are all what are considered to be GDEs and ecosystems that are potentially groundwater dependent. It can also include things like seeps and springs, as you can imagine, and a lot of times there's terrestrial vegetation. So if you imagine, you know, some of our cottonwoods or some of our riparian vegetation, that the roots are really tapped down underground and tapping into that groundwater, that could be a groundwater dependent ecosystem as well too, and sort of a community of species there. The GDEs are really important for a number of reasons. They provide habitat, they support biodiversity for threatened and endangered species, as well as a whole other slew of potential important services provided environmentally, as you can see listed there. So GDEs can be impacted mostly by these two things relating to SGMA, which would be the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, and another one of our sustainability indicators, a depletion of interconnected surface waters. So if you see this graphic here on the right, we've got sort of natural conditions here where we've got a pretty robust water table that's actually, you know, providing water into some of these streams or creeks in a gaining condition. And as you can see here, some of these trees that are upland and farther away from the stream or creek, they're still dependent on that groundwater because, like I said, that taproot and their roots are really accessing that water to survive. So some things that can happen if you look in the lower graphic here is that, you know, if there is an effect on that water table so much that it's actually, you know, drawing water away from the creek to create what's considered a losing condition. And so the surface water here is actually just draining down instead of being supplied by groundwater. That could create depletions of these interconnections between the surface water and the groundwater. And likewise, you can see here those same trees and roots, you know, that if that water table drops far enough from extraction, then it can affect groundwater dependent ecosystems. And the reason that we're talking about this is because they're a required element in every GSP and, you know, as a beneficial and use of water and users of water. So there's a number of places in the laws and regs that talk about it, and every GSP and every GSA needs to consider the ones that are within the jurisdiction, decide if they are GDEs or not, and do their best to make sure that they're not negatively impacted in that 20-year time frame. So what they've provided us, what DWR has provided us in concert with the Nature Conservancy, is this large potential GDE data set. So it's really just a database that was developed with a number of agencies. They went through with a number of resources and put expert review to provide what they're putting out to us to say, okay, these are all potential areas that could be groundwater dependent. And so it's available online. It's a web map app. It's user-friendly. You can go in and zoom into your specific area, click on, you know, what they've identified as potential GDEs. It'll tell you more about some of the dominant species or, you know, what they consider it to be. And so it's sort of a starting place. So what we start with is that potential map they gave us. But then, you know, here we still need to verify that there's a connection to groundwater. And so what they're saying is that, you know, these are potential, it's a starting point, but it's not the end all say all. So you have to, on your own jurisdiction and your own GSAs, verify and really look at the area and say, well, do we think there is a connection to groundwater or not, and why, and really kind of explain that. So before we even did this verification of groundwater, we worked with all the GSA managers really to look at potential GDEs in their own jurisdiction, to really look at some potential other criteria that would help us determine whether or not there was a groundwater connection. And I think I'll get into that in a couple slides here. But as you can see, this is sort of a zoomed in version of what it looks like for the 3 subbasins that we work in. And the orange and yellow areas are these potential GDEs. As you can see, a lot of them are really really adjacent to the creeks and streams because of, you know, that connection there. But in Butte Creek, there's about 2,400 potential GDEs. So what we did was we said, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and kind of see what other folks have done and really get our plan in place. So Yuba put together a GSP early. They addressed GDEs, and they're really one of the only Northern California GSAs that had even put together a GSP. The rest of them were due in 2020, but most of those critically overdrafted basins were south of us, and they don't actually have a lot of GDEs down there anymore. So we looked at that. We took a look at their approach and used portions of it. We talked to their staff and had some good in-depth conversations about, you know, why they chose that approach. And we also looked at the website. They have the TNC and DWR provided numerous guidance documents and attended some workshops to really get a handle on, you know, a good approach to this. And then also directly coordinated with TNC's lead on this, Kirk, who is really, you know, sort of the author of some of these products and some of these guidance documents. So we felt like we had a good handle on it. But really, so just to kind of understand how this works is that, you know, we enlisted the help of the GSA managers, many of whom are on this call right now, to actually go through and answer a series of questions and look at the polygons within, you know, your own boundaries to see what was potentially connected to groundwater. And then we formed a GDE working group to get feedback on our approach to analyzing GDEs and really kind of understand, you know, some of the potential questions or concerns with that. The GSA advisory committees, such as this group, eventually will review and make recommendations to the boards, to your boards, on the draft and final chapters in the GSPs, and this will be part of that. And then the GSA boards, again, approve those final GSPs. So this just kind of goes through a little bit of the workflow. But that first analysis by the managers, workshops, and then COVID hit, so we had to do all this remotely. But we did use a set of criteria to look at, you know, before we even got to that verification of groundwater, we said, okay, let's look at the land use. You know, is one of these polygons that's in the data set potentially now a parking lot or a golf course? You know, things have changed potentially since that database was set out. So we got, you know, the eyes on the ground to look at that. We pulled in some imagery from the drought to look and see, you know, if some of this vegetation was still lush and ripe and green during, you know, the worst parts of the drought, because that would indicate that there is some connection to groundwater. We also took a hard look at the proximity of these areas to irrigated agriculture, rice and other crops, because there's the thought is that, you know, with these pooled water, there is some lateral movement adjacent to that particular rice field or that irrigated ag field. And if this potential GDE is within a certain distance of that, you know, it could be actually accessing the surface water that's applied to the ground and surviving that way versus actually being, you know, tapped in underground. And then we looked at proximity to surface water and the types of water that's being put down specific areas. So, you know, if it was water that was just specifically just for, you know, say conveyance, something like that, the proximity to that really just kind of was a way for us to understand whether or not something was connected as well. So from that, we produced a database and conclusions, draft conclusions and maps for all the 4,600 polygons. And so with that, that took about 20% of the whole total is what the GSA managers looked at. And so for the remaining 80%, we said, okay, well, let's move ahead without, you know, necessarily going through this long process for each one of these, because we know that in the future there's going to be work done with the consultant team to really have a harder, deeper look at the verification or the connections to groundwater. So we said, okay, for the time being, we're going to designate them all the ones that weren't evaluated by the managers in the first phase as likely GDEs, and with the idea that that would be picked up, by Byron and his team as they get a little bit deeper into the SMC work. But what we are doing right now, and it's in the process of being revised, is pulling out those polygons that are near irrigated ag and rice, so that's, that those are basically pulled out as not likely GDEs as well too. So moving forward, the 20% that were done by the GSA managers, those conclusions will be moved forward. And then, like I said, we pulled out of the other 80%, we pulled out those that were near irrigated agriculture and rice. And then we're passing that along to the consultant team so they can do their further analysis to really verify the connection to groundwater. So those draft maps are under development. I have a couple of them that I pulled together today that we can look at real briefly. But this sort of goes through the same thing. It's under revision, going to be provided to the consultant teams, and as those discussions begin on sustainable management criteria and monitoring network, the GDEs will be considered and further refined by the consultant teams. So I think I'm out of time. Maybe I'm over. Sorry if I am. But with that, I'll open it up for any questions, or if you guys want to briefly look at the map, I can pull that up as well. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you so much. And just maybe a quick reminder, because I realize that there's so many acronyms here. There's so much information sort of coming at everyone through in this virtual space, that just a reminder of something that you said earlier in the presentation, Kelly, about where these GDEs will appear in the groundwater sustainability plan, and when people will have a chance to take a closer look at them.
Yeah, so GDEs have to be considered in a few places. You've got to identify them, and then you've also got to indicate in your GSP that, the SMC, which is, sorry about the acronyms, the sustainable management criteria that are set by these groups locally, there's a need to prove or to show that, you're not setting levels so low that it would impact those. And so you can look at things like rooting depths and things of that sort. And so that'll be partly in the basin setting work, which while that draft was out, we pulled this piece out of that and said, okay, this obviously ties into later portions of the plan that we're working on, with the SMC. So we're going to pull that out of the basin setting, and this is sort of on its own track. But like I said, those revisions are underway, but I'm thinking that that's probably going to get out and hit the streets here within the next, I would say, less than a month, after the management team has had a chance to review it a little bit more and such.
Great. Okay, it's really good to know that, and we will discuss more the GDE's application to sustainable management criteria, as you said. So we do have about 10 minutes, a little bit more like 8 minutes for any questions, clarifying questions that you might have about what has been done with the groundwater dependent ecosystems effort thus far. And so I'd like to start with the Butte Advisory Board members. We'll always start the conversation with you, and then we'll go to the public to see if there are any comments. So BAB members, any questions or follow-up you'd like to have with Kelly about GDEs? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone's hands go up, and if you're not able to find the proper button to push, I know sometimes it can be challenging. Just go ahead and speak up if you have a question, BAB members. Okay, and how about hearing none? How about any members of the public? Do you have any follow-up questions about the groundwater dependent ecosystems activities or efforts that Kelly presented about, Kelly Peterson from Butte County. All right, I'm not seeing anything. Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll look forward.
I've got to run to another meeting, but thank you all. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. And that's the crazy world of online meetings, right? It's like you used to be able to, you'd have to get in a car and travel, right? And you'd have time in between meetings, but now they're all stacked on top of each other. All right. Let's move on to Byron Clark from David's Engineering is going to spend some time with all of us talking about the sustainable management criteria and projects and management action. So today, Byron will be describing sort of the representative monitoring networks. He'll be presenting the draft approach, sort of considerations for the draft approach in setting the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives for the sustainable management criteria. I know this is a lot of jargon, but he'll get into that. And then we'll also sort of outline the projects and management actions approach and the initial criteria, those things that maybe you'll want to be considering for the development of the PMAs for the groundwater sustainability plans. So I'll let you take it away, Byron, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya, and good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay, and can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. So as Tanya had mentioned, today we'll be focusing on discussions of the sustainable management criteria and the approach that we plan to take in establishing those for the Butte Subbasin, as well as the status of projects and management actions and evaluation and refinement of projects and management actions, ideas that we've received that we'll incorporate into the plan. So with regards to sustainable management criteria, I'll provide a brief overview of and kind of a reminder of what that means in the context of Sigma jargon, and then dive into some of the specific approaches that we're looking at to develop, in particular, the minimum thresholds, but also considerations related to what are called the measurable objectives. And I'll explain in more detail what those mean. And then, again, with regards to projects and management actions, I'd just like to share a little bit on the ideas that have been received to date from various sources and stakeholders in the basin, and to talk about our screening and ranking criteria, or sort of our approach to evaluating and refining those projects for inclusion in the plan. So the sustainable management criteria in Sigma is sort of an overarching section of the plan, if you will, or concept that includes different components. And those are the sustainability goal and undesirable results statements, or sometimes some people refer to them as significant and unreasonable condition statements. And these are qualitative descriptions of what the vision is for management of the basin sustainably now and into the future, as well as in the undesirable results statements, a description for each of these 6 sustainability indicators described in Sigma of what we would like to avoid in order to ensure sustainable management of the basin. And then the other component or components associated with the sustainable management criteria are quantitative in nature. So these are actual numbers or values or thresholds, if you will, established at individual sites within the monitoring network to determine whether we're potentially having a significant and unreasonable condition that could constitute an undesirable result and state intervention. And so the minimum thresholds are that kind of that cliff that we want to avoid going off. If we exceed more than a certain number of minimum thresholds over a defined period of time, and both of those values are defined locally by you all and your respective boards, then that could constitute an undesirable result. And again, state intervention, which could include wellhead fees, extraction fees, et cetera, as well as the state stepping in and sort of mandating how the basin is to be managed until it can be taken over locally. Apart from that, measurable objectives are sort of like a yellow light, where if you're moving through time and you start to see, for example, declines in groundwater levels, the measurable objective is the area or level to which you'd like to operate the basin to provide what's called a margin of operational flexibility, or sort of a buffer between this measurable objective and the minimum threshold, during which time you can take action to better understand what is causing the condition and implement projects and management actions to correct for any undesirable results that could occur. And then finally, interim milestones are 5-year check marks that are established to track progress working towards managing to a measurable objective, to the extent that you're not already at that objective. And so I have a figure that I think may help demonstrate that more clearly. But quickly want to remind everyone of the 6 sustainability indicators that need to be addressed through these thresholds and objectives. So they will need to be established for groundwater levels, groundwater storage. Seawater intrusion is not applicable to the Butte Subbasin, but water quality is, as are land subsidence and surface water depletions. So we'll talk about each of those in a bit more detail here moving forward. So here's the figure I was referring to, illustrating an example of the quantitative sustainable management criteria. That is the minimum threshold, the measurable objective, and the interim milestones for an example of a monitoring well for groundwater levels. So what the graph shows is the groundwater elevation on the vertical axis and the time dimension on the horizontal axis. And kind of working our way up from the bottom, we see the red line that is titled minimum threshold. So that would be defined for a particular well as a groundwater elevation that we did not want to the water levels to go lower than, because that would potentially represent an undesirable result, which is the shaded area below the threshold. Instead, our objective is to manage to a measurable objective somewhere above that minimum threshold, and that's shown by the green line. And that difference between the measurable objective and the minimum threshold provides us this margin of operational flexibility, where if we enter into a drought or for whatever reason, conditions in the basin change due to increased pumping, changes in land use, et cetera, we have an opportunity to take action before exceeding that minimum threshold in order to make any corrections that might be needed. One thing to note about this example is that our current condition is actually above the measurable objective and well above the minimum threshold. And this is true for much of the Butte Subbasin likely. Groundwater conditions are generally good, and water levels are at historical highs in many locations. There are also cases elsewhere in the state where the current condition is well below the minimum threshold, which would come into effect 20 years after implementation. And so they will need to work their way to actually increasing groundwater levels over time. So before kind of diving into a discussion of the thresholds for the different sustainability indicators, I wondered if we might pause here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or make any clarifications that I can on sort of the overall structure of the sustainable management criteria and how they're applied.
I really appreciate that, Byron. It would be really good to check in with folks to also check your understanding of these key concepts, because then we're going to go much deeper into them. So if you have any questions for Byron, about what these mean, what the measurable objective is, what the minimum threshold is, what that margin in between, the margin of flexibility, of operational flexibility is. It would be great to take a moment to see if you have any questions. So I'll start with the Butte Advisory Board members. Are there any questions at this point for Byron?
I'd just like to make a comment or clarification if possible.
Yes, please, Greg.
So the minimum threshold is if we hit the minimum threshold, we're already in trouble. The goal is to deal with any situation at the level of measurable objective or somewhere slightly below that and stay clear of that minimum threshold. I thought the minimum threshold might be like a trigger point for activity, but actually a trigger point should be well above minimum threshold. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And just the one additional concept to layer in there is exceeding one minimum threshold does not necessarily constitute a quote unquote undesirable result. It's some number over some period of time that you can define locally. From what we've seen in neighboring basins, an undesirable result is often described as more than 25% of the monitoring sites exceeding the minimum threshold over 2 consecutive years or something like that. So there's that additional opportunity for a little bit of just to recognize that one well may not be representative of the entire basin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. That was a really good clarification. I'm sure that everybody benefited from. And anyone else have questions or clarifications about these key concepts on the BAB? And then I'll do the same and ask the members of the public if you have any questions. Okay, any members of the public have any questions for Byron about these concepts? I'm not seeing any questions, Byron. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll move on. So the next thing I'd like to do is just go through each of the sustainability indicators, some in more detail this time than others, although we'll expect to have more discussion in the future as well, and talk about how we intend or plan to develop those and to give some initial examples to kind of get us all thinking about how these can be set. And so for each of these, I've kind of set up this where, why, what, how structure. So with respect to groundwater levels, where are the thresholds established? Again, they're uniquely established for each representative monitoring well in the basin. So whether we're looking at historical groundwater levels or depths of nearby wells or those types of things, they're going to be looked at uniquely for each of the wells to represent what's happening in the vicinity of that well. Why do we establish these thresholds? It's to avoid potential significant and unreasonable conditions, which could trigger an undesirable result. Things like dewatering of domestic wells, avoiding increased pumping costs due to increased lifts, and impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems as well. What supporting information do we have to establish these criteria? We have information from DWR on well completion report data that describes the historical construction of wells and describes their depth. So that helps us understand the risk of dewatering, for example, domestic wells, should groundwater levels decline in the future. We have historical observed water levels, so we can see what declines have occurred at each well historically, and to get an idea of what those trends might look like in the future. And then we have the information that Kelly described on nearby potential GDEs and the likelihood of a given area being a GDE. And so the approach that we anticipate for establishing these thresholds then is to consider a combination of these factors for each site so that we can be sensitive to, the heterogeneous or varying conditions within the basin. And where we don't have enough information, for example, in the context of groundwater dependent ecosystems, Kelly spoke about how because of the abundance of surface water in the Butte Subbasin, it's difficult to determine or definitively, which areas might be dependent on groundwater or partially dependent or dependent solely on surface water. And so there will likely need to be additional monitoring to assess the potential impacts of GDEs. Another question is, to the extent that there is a GDE, is it being sustained by shallow perched groundwater that's separated from the regional aquifer and therefore less, kind of under the control of the GSAs to manage? And so there are a lot of questions out there that will need to be addressed as part of GSP implementation likely. So just to try to provide an illustrative example for a couple of wells about how we can look at setting thresholds. This figure shows time on the horizontal axis, groundwater elevation in terms of feet above mean sea level on the left axis, and then inversely or conversely, depth to groundwater on the right side axis. And so we can see that at this well, up in the very northeastern portion of the basin, the ground surface elevation is about 144 feet. And historical groundwater levels, based on the period of record, have varied between about 130 feet and as low as about 105 or 110 feet. Well, actually, if we look at 2015, as low as about 90 feet. And then also drawn, and so that's the blue line that shows not only the variation over time, but also variation between the spring and the fall each year. And so I've added some lines to the figure to show different potential ways to set thresholds. And so one potential threshold would be 30 feet below the ground surface for GDEs, based on guidance provided by TNC and the typical maximum rooting depth of groundwater dependent species in the region, Central Valley as a whole. In this case, we see that groundwater levels have been below that threshold in the past. And so one could look back, as Kelly referred to, at satellite information, for example, during that period during which the groundwater levels were low, and see if there's any detectable impact on these potential GDEs. The next line shown is the maximum historical depth, which was in the fall of 2015 at the end of the recent drought. So that could be a basis for setting a threshold as well, or perhaps some range could be added to that to allow for somewhat additional declines in groundwater levels in the future due to potential drought conditions moving forward. The next line, minimum recommended domestic well depth. Given requirements for annular seals in domestic wells that are newly constructed, and considering some screen depth as well, we could set up, kind of an estimate of what we think the minimum required well depth should be and set a threshold that would be protective of that. Another approach that we've seen a lot in other basins is to use a percentile depth of nearby domestic wells. So these would be the closest wells to this particular monitoring well. And if we were to look at the 20th percentile depth of nearby domestic wells, that means that 80% of the wells available based on the DWR data set are deeper than that 20th percentile line. And so if we were to use the minimum threshold to stay above that line, we would be protective of 80% of the domestic wells that are out there based on the available data. So these are all options. Our next steps here would be to take a look at all of the wells in the basin systematically, to take a look at some examples for thresholds for further discussion, and to look at what the implications of these different percentiles or other considerations would be on where those thresholds would be set. So this is an analogous slide, but for a well right in the middle of the basin. This well has behaved quite differently in terms of groundwater levels in the past, remaining very constant over time based on the available record, with the exception of 2015, which was a curtailment year and pumping occurred, where groundwater levels declined by about 10 feet, but recovered by the next year. And so in this case, it probably doesn't make sense to set a threshold based on the historical depth, because there hasn't really been any pumping that has occurred, and that historical depth is very shallow, unless there's some significant undesired or unreasonable effect of additional pumping in this area. It seems like one could consider the GDE threshold or one of the thresholds based on domestic wells. So let me stop there in terms of the minimum thresholds we wanted to, for groundwater levels, we wanted to open things up for questions, clarifications, and any recommendations or guidance that you all might offer.
Yes, and Byron, thank you very much. Here you've outlined two questions. So just maybe clarify what you're asking of the BAB here when you say additional potential significant and unreasonable conditions.
Sure. Yeah. So we've, in terms of tangible impacts that we might want to avoid to maintain sustainability and satisfy the sustainability goal, we're taking a look at the groundwater levels because of impacts on lift and other considerations. Looking at the well depths in order to protect existing well infrastructure, and also looking at these thresholds relative to the groundwater dependent ecosystems. Are there other things that we want to avoid by protecting groundwater levels that we should be considering? Would be the question.
Let's start with that. Yeah, let's start with that. I think it's helpful to go sort of a question at a time. So thank you for framing up that question. So for any of the, if there are other potential significant and unreasonable conditions that you wish to avoid, any factors, it would be helpful to receive that input from the BAB now. So any thoughts there, advisory board members?
Yeah. This is Todd Kimmelshoe. I don't know if this is the spot for this, but something that might have some potential significant issues is what other adjacent GSAs are doing, where they're setting their thresholds at. Is there a way that could affect how we set our thresholds in the Butte District? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and a big question, really. So the CBI and the county are leading an effort now on interbasin coordination, I believe with funding from the Water Foundation, but Tanya and Christina or whomever who's involved could clarify that. But I think that addresses.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just want to clarify there. No, it is through the Department of Water Resources Facilitation Support Services Program. That's what's funding it. Go ahead, Byron.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Perhaps more direct to this discussion, the way that thresholds are defined across basin boundaries could certainly have an impact on the Butte Basin's ability to avoid exceeding minimum thresholds, because they're, the groundwater's all connected, right? So if water levels were to be drawn down substantially in an adjacent basin, that could have an impact on the Butte Subbasin's ability to maintain sustainability. And I'm struggling a little bit with what the regulations specifically say with regards to that. They encourage interbasin coordination agreements, but they're not required. But I think there is language that does state that setting thresholds in one basin in a particular way cannot adversely affect neighboring basins. Not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I hope that is the case, because I think that this could end up being one of the biggest issues in regards to setting thresholds. If one neighboring GSA is completely different, or there's a large variance in from one to the other, I think it could have a huge impact on some of the adjacent GSAs. So
yeah,
to throw that out there, but I'm glad it's being addressed.
Tanya, this is Supervisor Lucero. I was wondering, have we discussed how many domestic wells would go dry? I know that that's been a discussion in the VINA GSA as a point of reference for board members to understand. And here we've just, made a line and said a percentage of domestic wells would go dry. Sometimes I find it helpful to have a number attached to that.
Supervisor Lucero, thank you for the question. And then I see Anjanette, I see with Western Canal Water District, your hand is up, and we'll get to you in just a moment. Yeah, so Deborah, I think we're taking it, there's Byron with David's Engineering, he can speak to this, but Byron, I'll just say something before you get into this, just because you may not be as informed of how the VINA the geosyntech is addressing this in the VINA subbasin. So we're at a little bit of a different point here in the Butte subbasin. What Byron is doing today is he's presenting concepts to you about possible ways that you could set your minimum threshold. So he's not coming to you suggesting that it should be pinned to domestic wells at like the 15th percentile or something. And then the key information for you to have associated with that would be to understand, well, what would that mean? What would be the implications of that? So I think that right now we're still more in a conceptual stage, and we appreciate your input, because if that is an area where the Butte Advisory Board would like to see, well, the next step for us would be to understand what might, if we're interested in pinning the minimum threshold to domestic wells, we'd like to see what the potential impacts would be. What would that mean at the 10th percentile or the 15th percentile in terms of what, how many wells could potentially go dry? So just to say, we're at a different, we're sort of at the conceptual phase in this subbase, which is a little bit different than how VINA is approaching this. Byron, what would you say in response?
Yeah, I would just confirm that the data sets that we're using to develop these percentiles include a count of the number of wells, within the vicinity of each monitoring well. And so we could count how many wells have a depth shallower than that 20th percentile, which would be the ones that would be vulnerable, and total those up, by monitoring well or for the basin as a whole, quite easily.
And do you imagine that would be an information item that you may bring to a future conversation with the GSA managers in the BAB?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Supervisor Lucero. And Jeanette Shadley with Western Canal Water District.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't tell because of my icon says I'm on mute, but my phone number says I'm not. So I just want to make sure. So I appreciate everything that has been said so far. And I think I've asked this question before. And my understanding is that the minimum threshold is far below what the average well depth is for domestic. And then my other comment was that the Butte Subbasin definitely has different characteristics than our surrounding basins. And so we need to be mindful that our conditions are not the same as our adjacent ones, I guess. I just repeated that twice, so I apologize. But is that the same understanding, Byron, as the minimum thresholds are normally far below what our normal domestic well would be?
That's correct. Yeah. So if we set it at the 50th percentile or median, that would be, half the wells would be shallower, half would be deeper. But by setting it at the 20%, 80% of the wells are shallower than that threshold. So it's a deeper, it's a lower threshold in terms of elevation.
So since we're getting into a discussion of the approaches to establishing minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, let me just stop for a moment, check in with the public to see if you have any questions or input based on what's been discussed. And then I want to go back to the BAB and see if you have any suggestions for approaches to establishing the minimum threshold. So we've talked a little bit about what might be additional potential significant and unreasonable conditions that you'd like considered. I wonder if the public has any input on that specific question. Okay, I'm not seeing any. BAB members, any further discussion on or suggestions for different approaches for establishing the minimum threshold and measurable objectives? And Byron, it might be helpful for you to go back to, because your graphics are so clear, it might be good to go back to one of those examples that shows the different lines, right, of different options.
Right, and these aren't all the options. There are infinite options basically, but these show some of the different factors that can be considered. And what I mean by that, for example, I have maximum historical depth, 2015. Well, you could do one based on depth that again adds some buffer below that to allow for some further decline due to drought or other factors. So there's, even within these, there's room for adjustment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it'd be nice to hear from BAB members about any questions you have or suggestions about when looking at some of these factors that could be taken into consideration for setting measurable objectives and minimum thresholds, if you have some ideas or thoughts that you want to share. And if you have some specific suggestions or recommendations that you'd like to sort of put out there.
Byron, this is Gary Stone, RID. What is your strategy on monitoring the depth of wells in communities?
We would use the nearest well in the existing monitoring network, and I don't know how many of those offhand are located within the communities themselves. I'm looking at the map over to the right. It's pretty hard to make out, but I see, there's a well a few miles east of Biggs, one a few miles west of Biggs, one about a mile or two northwest of Gridley. Richvale doesn't show up on the map, so I'm not quite sure how close that would be. But the idea is that we would use these existing wells for that purpose at this time. If there were a need to to fill any data gaps that might emerge, to better understand what's happening in the communities. That could be done. Are you particularly concerned with water levels or water quality or other factors?
I guess more water level, just so that we understand inside the community. I'm sure all the wells are different depths over time when they were drilled.
Right. Yeah, so we will have that information to the extent that they filed a well log. And we have well logs going back to around 1950 or so. So that information, for those well depths would be associated with the nearest monitoring well.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Gary. Any other questions or suggestions for Byron on setting measurable objectives and minimum thresholds for groundwater levels? And we will go to the other sustainability indicators next. Okay, Byron, go ahead.
Okay, some of these will go fairly quickly because we, in many cases, anticipate relying on water level monitoring for the other sustainability indicators, or at least for some of those. One of which is groundwater storage. So the threshold for groundwater storage is defined for the basin as a whole, as opposed to individual monitoring sites. Although the storage estimates for over time would most likely be based on water level measurements and estimates of the porosity, essentially, of the aquifer system. What we're trying to avoid, or why we would establish a threshold for groundwater storage, would be to avoid dewatering of the fresh groundwater aquifer. So basically the total depletion of the available fresh water for irrigation and other beneficial uses. So some of the considerations involved are that there's approximately 30 million acre feet of freshwater storage in the Butte Subbasin. So it's a pretty vast resource. Although, one would have to, obviously, to access all of that water would need to lower the groundwater, probably 1,000 feet in some places to get to fully deplete the freshwater aquifer. Another consideration is that we're unable to monitor storage directly. We need to use indirect methods, such as the groundwater model or groundwater level monitoring over time. Because of the large amount of storage relative to the somewhat small variability in groundwater levels that we anticipate and would expect to allow based on thresholds for water levels that we've just covered, we think that protecting water levels based on the criteria established for that sustainability indicator would avoid substantial dewatering of the groundwater aquifer, given its size. So for these reasons, we would use groundwater levels instead of some other estimate of storage to set a threshold and to monitor for sustainability. Here's just a look from the basin setting at groundwater storage over time. The shading in the bars on this graph represents the hydrologic year type. So blue are the wetter years, red are the critically dry years, and green, kind of so on in between. The blue bars represent the change in storage each year, estimated from 2000 through 2018. And so we can see during the wet years, for example, 2006, 11 and 17 water going into storage. During the drier years, water generally coming out of storage. And a cumulative decrease over this period of about 160,000 acre feet, which is the dashed line and the axis on the right. And so I guess the takeaway here is that we would continue to update this figure, but use groundwater levels to be able to demonstrate that we're not substantially depleting the amount of fresh water in storage. So with that, really the same two questions. Should we be concerned about other potential undesirable conditions or results associated with storage? And are there any suggestions for other approaches to establishing the MTs and MOs? This approach is, I think, being pretty commonly used in other basins as well. But wanted to invite any feedback that you all have.
Butte Advisory Board members, any feedback for Byron?
Tina, this is Bo Shepherd. One of the questions or comments, I guess, really is that most of the data seems like it's at least a couple of years in the rears. And, you know, this year, all the projections I'm hearing that snowpack is low and, you know, in other words, it's going to be a potentially a low surface water year. And, you know, so that means more pumping, but it feels like that we're always a year or two or a couple of years behind on, you know, where we really stand. Is that the case, or are we actually keeping up with it current? In other words, are they pulling data now and we're just not getting it for a year or two? And data meaning depths of wells and
Right.
depletion of groundwater.
Right. So much of the work that's been done for what's called the basin setting, so with the water budgets, things like that, was done using the model, which we were able to update through 2018 as part of that effort. But it is not being updated continuously over time. Instead, what's happening is a transition to more reliance on monitoring as the plan is adopted and implemented. And so monitoring activities continue. So groundwater level data is being collected, water quality data, et cetera. Other data that will be updated on a continuous basis moving forward to implement the plan. And so, yeah, I think the answer is with the planning activities, like the water budgets and things like that, we always end up being a couple years behind, but try to, you know, learn what we can and apply that to developing the plan, essentially. But in order to implement Sigma, it'll be focused on continuous monitoring of these different sustainability indicators.
And if I could, one more question. There's the resources to, in other words, financially, you have the resources to do everything that is needed to get that data?
I think so. We've talked some about potentially additional monitoring of salinity in some areas, particularly around the Sutter Buttes. So that would be somewhat of an extension of existing monitoring activities. But otherwise, I think the existing activities by the counties and DWR will be sufficient for plan implementation at this time. There are other data gaps as well that I think we may want to try to fill over time, like better understanding the shallow perch groundwater system in GDE areas, those types of things. And so we would build those into the plan as so-called management actions that could be implemented subject to available funding moving forward. So that would be an opportunity to include something into the plan that we could seek funding for to ultimately implement.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Bo. Butte Advisory Board members, any other questions for Byron on these indicators before we go to the last two? And how about members of the public? Okay, Byron, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So groundwater quality, similar to groundwater levels, quality thresholds would be established uniquely for each representative monitoring well. And so this would not necessarily be all of the monitoring wells used for levels, but maybe many of those wells, as well as potentially some dedicated groundwater quality monitoring wells. But these thresholds would be established for each one individually. And what we're trying to avoid with Sigma is the adverse impacts of groundwater management to drinking water or to irrigation water for crop production primarily, or that would otherwise affect beneficial results, or sorry, beneficial uses. And so the reason we say adverse impacts of groundwater management to drinking water and to irrigation water is that there are existing programs that monitor and regulate water quality, like the Title 22 Drinking Water Program, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, CV salts, as well as DWR's monitoring programs for groundwater substitution transfers that happen in the southern portion of the basin or adjacent basins. And so our focus here, to provide one specific example, is to implement sufficient monitoring potentially to be able to detect and prevent migration of connate seawater, so upwelling of ancient seawater, particularly in the vicinity of the Sutter Buttes, although there may be some other potential water quality concerns that will need to be addressed. But again, the idea is to focus on things that are affected by groundwater pumping, groundwater recharge, and the like, because that is the type of activity that really falls under the GSA purview or GSA's purviews. And so those thresholds could be set based on maximum contaminant levels related to drinking water, crop salinity thresholds to avoid yield loss, or historical observations. If historically a well has had salinity levels above existing thresholds, then we couldn't likely remediate that or correct for that. But we could use that as a baseline then to avoid further degradation that could otherwise occur. Here's an example of a figure from the county's trend monitoring program for the Big West Gridley area, where groundwater quality has been measured annually, including electrical conductivity and pH. And so here we see a baseline of water quality in this well with electrical conductivity around 300 microsiemens per centimeter, which is within the range of irrigation tolerance as well as drinking water tolerance. But this provides good information that can be built upon to help establish those thresholds for these existing wells, as well as for any new ones that might be installed. So with that, I open it up for any discussion on water quality.
Yes, so BAB members, any additional potential significant and unreasonable conditions you'd like to be considered, or suggestions or for the approach here, just open it up to Butte Advisory Board members. And how about members of the public? I'm not seeing anything, Byron.
Okay.
And just to let you know, Byron, we've scheduled this until 2:40, and so we have just under 20 minutes remaining.
Okay, I think we're probably in good shape.
Great, thank you.
Another sustainability indicator that will need to be addressed is surface water depletions. So these are, I'm going to skip ahead to what? Reductions in stream flow due to additional pumping in the basin. So if we have some baseline groundwater use and stream flow information, for example, from the model, and we look at potential changes in pumping demands in the future, the model can help us understand how those stream flows might decrease due to additional pumping. And that's one point of reference. We can also look at available monitoring data where we have it in terms of groundwater levels adjacent to streams and the stage of the stream to understand to some extent, whether the stream is gaining water from the groundwater system or losing water to the groundwater system and how that might change over time. And what we're trying to avoid here are adverse impacts to beneficial uses of surface water. So be they irrigation water users or the environment or any other beneficial users. So the approach that we're planning to take is to evaluate potential depletions relative to current conditions. So we have these different scenarios that we've developed using the model for current conditions and then for future conditions with climate change. And so we can look at how any increases in pumping under those climate change scenarios would affect the flow to streams in the basin. We will also identify and evaluate existing stream gauges and monitoring wells in the basin and look for data gaps. Frankly, there aren't a lot of paired stream gauges and monitoring wells out there to rely upon. So that's an area where we'll likely need more monitoring in the future. And so we would incorporate a management action into the GSP to provide for additional monitoring over time as funding is identified. And then ultimately, we think in this case, we can probably evaluate stream impacts based on the groundwater level thresholds. And so what the approach we can take is to look at if we were to increase pumping in the basin to the extent that we were beginning to hit thresholds or exceed thresholds, what would the impacts to streams be? And if based on local discussion, those are not considered significant and reasonable, then we could conclude that protecting groundwater levels would also be protective of streams. It could be the case that under that scenario, the stream losses are considered significant and unreasonable, in which case we would need to look at perhaps a different set of water level thresholds related to stream depletions or other considerations. Our current understanding of the basin, based on the water budgets developed as part of the basin setting work, is that the streams in the Butte Subbasin, both that traverse it and that travel its boundaries, by and large, with the exception of a small portion of the Sacramento River, are gaining streams. So the groundwater system is essentially feeding the streams because the water levels near the surface are higher than the stage of the stream. So the water flows from the groundwater system into the stream, increasing its flow. Although we do anticipate less gain in the future because of increased groundwater demands that are projected. Some of that would come out of storage and be reflected in lowering of groundwater levels, but much of it would also be reflected in reduced flows in the streams and changes to interbasin flows as well. Perhaps less water flowing south into the Butte Subbasin, for example. So we'll just circle back to the same couple of questions here. Go ahead, Tanya.
Yes, just opening it up for any questions of clarification or input like we've done with the other topics.
Yeah, this is Todd Kimmelshoe. It doesn't seem like this would be an issue at all. If the streams and the groundwater are connected, I don't see this as an issue in the Butte Subbasin, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I think it sort of depends on perspective. That, you know, the decreased gain in stream flows ends up as decreased flow in the Sacramento River and decreased flow in the Delta potentially. So, you know, some may see that as an impact. From a local basin perspective, I don't see it as troubling. In fact, the reason that the streams are really gaining in this area, I think, is just because of in large part, because of the use of surface water historically. The aquifer is essentially full and discharging to the streams because of that historical surface water use.
Any follow-up there, Todd? Supervisor Kimmelshoe?
No, I don't think there's yeah, I think because the water table is so high in the Butte Subbasin, you know, I don't think this really is significant in the groundwater situation. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I see some others of you may have gone off mute. Any other thoughts or comments here?
Yeah, Grant Carmen here. I noticed there was a small portion along the Sacramento River there where it was actually into the negative. Is it like a geological reason why we would be losing 80% of the time in that area? Or can you just expand on that a little bit, maybe?
Sure. I'm afraid my answer isn't super satisfying. I think the shorter answer is I don't know. The Sacramento River is the western boundary of the model. And so we make certain assumptions about the groundwater levels along that boundary in order to calculate the flows with the neighboring Colusa Subbasin and the exchanges with the Sacramento River. And because of that, it creates a lot of uncertainty as to what's exactly happening along that boundary. So it's an area that we've identified as something that should be, you know, explored further in the future. Okay. I know that's not a good answer, but yeah, we just don't know exactly at this point.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, Grant. Any other questions of clarification or input anyone would like to provide? FAB members, and then I'll go to members of the public.
Bo Shepherd, I have another question. Have the wildfires played in, or have the effects of the wildfire been measured in the surface groundwater quality or surface water quality at all in this? Because I know, for example, in Paradise, when they had the campfire, one of the, I forget the canal name, but essentially it was, you know, it doesn't have water anymore in it since the campfire. So are things, you know, like the past fires, do they even play into any of this in terms of water quality or effects that having the, you know, as many acres burn,
Yeah.
how that's going to play out.
Well, that's a good question. So the model itself doesn't take into account water quality. It's really estimating flow of water through the basin. You know, one of the things I think that the Camp Fire and the more recent fire could affect is runoff, you know, from the mountain areas into the basin as that vegetation is removed and the soil becomes glazed. You could have more runoff occurring, and that's not been incorporated at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. I'm going to members of the public. I see Deborah, Supervisor Lucero, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. I just had a follow-up question on that, on the river where it's losing, and obviously if that's a boundary, again, this is where the voluntary agreements are going to come into play. Is that correct?
That's, yeah, potentially, depending on what's actually, you know, what ends up in the agreements, yeah.
Because
Or
something
that's where,
I'm sorry, go
I would
ahead,
just want to,
Tanya.
I'm sorry, Deborah, that's where I would just want to clarify, that's where interbasin coordination discussions come into play. Whether voluntary agreements are established is something that would need to be agreed upon by the various basins, right? Just clarifying that SGMA, the regulations do make them voluntary. They're not required. But anyway, go ahead.
So if they're not required, though, going back to what Byron was saying earlier about one sub-basin affecting another, what information do we have in terms of hydrology studies showing what's happening on one side of the river compared to the other side of the river in this basin? You know, do we have enough information, or are we kind of guessing on that boundary as to how the waters are flowing?
So some of the tools that we have to better understand what's happening along that boundary are the regional models developed by DWR. So there's C2VSIM and SVSIM, which cover the whole valley. And so they don't have that same limitation that the Butte Basin model has, where that boundary is along the river. So they're able to simulate what's happening on both sides. So that provides some insight into what's happening along the river. You know, other sources of information are DWR water level contours, which give us an indication of the direction of flow along that boundary. And those would be the main sources that come to mind. I'm sure that that type of information has been looked at in specific reports by USGS or others, but not specific ones don't come to mind right now.
I guess my point on that is that something that this basin would have to create a plan for?
Yes. Well, I would have to. I'm not sure, but I think has planned to. Yeah. Yes. I mean, we certainly included the idea in the basin setting document as to being a data gap to be filled moving forward, as well as the model document that's still under preparation. And so it's been identified that additional work that kind of would be a high priority in moving things forward. One of the ideas that's come up is to use some of these regional models to develop the estimates along that boundary and essentially swap those out for what the Butte Basin model is estimating. think it would start with a comparison and then potentially refinements based on that more regional model.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Supervisor Lucero. And I know, and Christina Buck first, Mariana. I think Christina Buck has a follow-up.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll go to you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I
Yes.
just have a quick follow-up, Byron. You just touched on that in that last statement. Offhand, I mean, as Calusa, I think that's our Calusa Subbasin neighbor, right? Are they there yet in terms of looking at the model results from the model they're using for the Sac River? Do you have a sense of if it's indicating a similar thing, or is that kind of a next step?
I think I can say that the Calusa model is indicating kind of an interbasin flow from Calusa to Butte, albeit they're fairly small, which I think is quite different from what the Butte Basin model is having. I haven't, in terms of the stream aquifer interaction along the Sacramento River, I'm a little bit less certain where things stand in terms of that comparison.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Mariana, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add that when we give the interbasin coordination update at the end, some of the things that we would love to hear from all of you is what type of information would be useful related to interbasin coordination moving forward. And I think it's something that you can keep on the back of your mind, but that we would be very interested in learning more about. And this could be one of them.
Thank you. Okay, anything, any other questions of clarification or input before Byron continues? We do want to get a little bit into, we're short on time at this point, Byron, but I think we do want to give a little bit of an overview of the PMA process thus far.
Sure. Would you like me to go ahead?
Yes, go ahead. We are at 2:40, so I think we might need to truncate this a little bit.
Okay. So the way we're looking at projects and management actions is a required section of the GSP to describe projects or sort of infrastructure programs and things like that, or water banks or whatnot that could be used to maintain or achieve sustainability and management actions. So more software type solutions to help achieve or maintain sustainability or to increase knowledge of the basin. And the way we're looking at those is sort of a toolbox of activities, again, to avoid or address sustainability concerns. And when I say toolbox, what I'm thinking of, unlike the San Joaquin Valley in some areas where there's a clear need to take corrective action to basically recover water levels to a point of sustainability, it's less clear what level of activities in terms of projects and management actions will be needed for the Butte Subbasin at this time, because they're, depending upon how you define significant and unreasonable for stream depletions, for example, that would have an impact on whether or not that needs to be addressed. So it was good to hear the input from Supervisor Kimmelshoe regarding that. I think we'll want to have more discussions along those lines here moving forward. And so the idea is to be inclusive, to have a suite of actions that could be taken, rather than a definite list of things that will be done, because again, it's a little bit less clear what's going to be needed moving forward. Those would be developed at a planning level for inclusion in the GSP, so not necessarily shovel ready, but ready for further development and permitting and other steps in implementing the project ultimately. They've largely been based on projects from existing ag water management plans, urban water management plans, other past studies such as by the County of Butte, submittals by other local entities, and are being refined to meet the GSP requirements as to what's to be reported in the GSP. And so just to paraphrase this slide, I mean, what we learned from the water budgets is that by 2070, with climate change impacts on hydrology and water supplies, we may see increased pumping of around 50,000 acre feet per year, but only a decrease in groundwater storage of around 2,000 acre feet per year. And again, that's because the balance is made up from decreased gains to streams and changes to interbasin flows. And so if we're trying to maintain storage, you know, 2,000 acre feet per year out of 300,000 or 400,000 acre feet per year of annual pumping is almost in the noise. It's unclear whether storage is in balance. And again, we need to determine locally what is significant and unreasonable with respect to these stream depletions and changes to interbasin flows. So far, we've received 21 ideas for projects and management actions. We have some others that we're working to add to the list. They generally fall under categories of distribution system modernization to more effectively manage surface water supplies within the basin, improvements to diversions to better access surface water where there may be challenges due to diversion structures or other bottlenecks or constraints, as well as dual source irrigation systems to encourage growers who have access to both surface water and groundwater, but may be inclined to use groundwater for certain reasons to make the most use of available surface water supplies. And in terms of management actions, increase understanding of the basin, we're looking at things like improved surface water outflow measurement, groundwater monitoring wells, particularly in shallow areas, and to better understand salinity, as we discussed. Some additional ideas are groundwater dependent ecosystem monitoring on a near continuous basis using satellites, maybe something that could be incorporated into the plan and be an effective way to monitor the 4,000 plus polygons out there without substantial cost. Additional streams and paired shallow monitoring wells. So this would be to better understand surface water, groundwater interaction, and other expanded monitoring in areas of concern. We've released a draft PMA. I'm sorry, I got off track there. The draft evaluation criteria are being used to better characterize the potential projects and management actions, and include looking at things like initial and ongoing costs, benefits relative to each of the sustainability indicators, be them groundwater levels or storage or stream depletions or water quality, a description of the status of development of the project at this point, an understanding of the legal authorities, administrative permitting, and regulatory compliance requirements, and an assessment of stakeholder support. There is also a web form that has been released at the link shown and allows anyone interested to submit an idea for a project or a management action. It's a short questionnaire that can give us a way to get in touch with you and provide you an opportunity to provide some ideas on different projects or management actions that could be effective and included as part of the GSP. And the path forward here is to incorporate these into the GSP by refining the descriptions and supporting information for the submitted PMAs to align with the GSP requirements, to look at additional ideas beyond those received from the stakeholder group, and then to develop summaries of each for the PMA chapter of the GSP.
Thank you, Byron. And you'll notice that the agenda package did link to the PMA solicitation form on the agenda. And really the idea is here, if there's any idea, no matter how conceptual it is, that you think would address concerns that you or your organization might have, that you can use that form to submit those ideas. So let me first go, I know we're running short on time. Let me first go to the Butte Advisory Board members to see if you have questions about, what Byron has presented regarding the approach suggested approach to PMAs. We'll start with the BAB members and then go to members of the public. And Anjanette reminds me that there's also a link on the website, and along with, we try to really provide a good amount of information on Butte basingroundwater.org, and we invite you to go to the website for that information on the PMA solicitation form. Okay, I'm not, BAB members, advisory board members, any questions here? And then going to members of the public, any questions you have, anything you'd like to raise about what's been presented about the PMAs?
This is Supervisor Lucero again. Of course, I'm, I guess, probably comparing this to the Vina GSA, the way we've proceeded, but I'm just curious why Butte has PMAs at this point when MTs and MOs haven't yet been set. What are the PMAs? And maybe it's, because there's a variety of PMAs. I'm just not understanding the process. And then where do these PMAs live online?
I don't believe the spreadsheet with the PMAs has been published at this point. There are certainly many of the same projects that are in the ag water management plans and urban water management plans adopted by the agencies that prepare those. I think in terms of identifying them at this point, as I mentioned, we're really trying to put together a toolbox or a menu of things that could be done to address salinity or sustainability, concerns moving forward, kind of regardless of where the MTs and MOs are set. I mean, we know the types of things that can be done to maximize the use of surface water supplies, reduce dependence on groundwater, et cetera. So it's just a means of kind of in parallel cataloging and describing these ideas with the idea they would ultimately be included in the GSP as options that could be implemented as needed. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I guess I'm looking at parallel processes here and just wondering how they're working. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for the questions. All right, are there any other questions on Byron's presentation? We do have limited time, and there have been a couple of questions related to interbasin coordination activities that have come up today. And so I do want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to give you an update on that. And so Byron, I think we'll just move to that. You can stop your screen sharing. Thank you very much for your presentation today and your clear description of what is a technical and complex subject. Okay, I want to start, I think what I'd like to do here is maybe go to, on our agenda, this is our update section, and I think I'd like to start it off with our update on interbasin coordination, and then if the GSAs could just be thinking about any quick updates that are important to share with the other GSAs and members of the public. We'll see if there are any other GSA updates after we discuss the interbasin coordination activities. Okay, so I will pass it off to my colleague Mariana, who's going to give you an update on recent activities for interbasin coordination. Mariana?
Thank you, Tanya. Can you hear me okay? Great. So
yeah.
I'm just going to go through this update really briefly, and I'm happy to respond to any questions after the meeting as well. So some of you have heard this presentation before, but the most recent updates is that staff from the 11 subbasins that have been meeting had the last meeting on February 1st, and the goals for this meeting was to reflect on shared learnings from the effort so far and determine priorities moving forward. In every meeting, all of us at Basins provide updates on their GSP development status and provide key takeaways from different meetings they've had on a neighbor-to-neighbor basis. Meeting summaries and agendas are available at the website, so you can get more details online. In terms of next steps, staff and consulting teams will continue to share technical information to better understand regional conditions. Efforts now are beginning to shift towards establishing a framework for continued cooperation and interbasin coordination throughout GSP implementation. And Subbasin representatives will continue to give updates such as this one at the different public venues to gather input as we continue guiding the next steps. So some food for thought. I'll put these questions in the chat and we will revisit them in the future. We would love to get your input about what you think are the most important priorities, concerns, or possible ideas for interbasin coordination throughout GSP implementation. So some of the questions that we have are, what are the most important questions you have related to interbasin coordination? And some of them came up during the meeting, including where are the different sustainability SMCs set up at the different basins? Those are like the questions that we were looking for. And also, what do you think is the most important, most valuable and important issues to discuss? So just keep them in your mind and we would love to hear them. You can reach out to CBI through email or during the next meetings as well. So if you want to be involved, you could receive updates from your GSA interested party lists, different websites, these meetings, and this slide has a link to the Interbasin Coordination website where we have more materials and information available for you. And you can always reach out to me or Dr. Christina Buck with any questions. I hope I didn't take too long, but Tanya, do you want to add anything, or Christina or Anjanette?
No, thank you very much. I don't have anything to add, just in the interest of time, but Christina or Anjanette, do you have anything that you'd like to add? And then we can go to any public questions. And maybe Mariana, you could throw those questions in the chat, as you said in your presentation.
Yes,
Christina or Anjanette, any?
I see a question in the chat afterwards. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
This is Christina. I would just add, maybe just as an example, I think that issue of the Sac River is an example of kind of the technical information sharing that can happen and influence the plans that are being developed right now. You know, knowing what Calusa Subbasin modeling tools and knowing the limitation of the Butte Basin model. But in the longer term question of how do we actually coordinate these SMCs, I think that's where we're hoping to pivot to figuring out how that long-term conversation happens throughout the region. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Christina. And any questions from the BAB members, the Butte Advisory Board members, about intercoordination activities at this time? Or any responses that you have to what are the most important questions you have related to interbasin coordination? And what do you think would be most valuable, important to discuss? I think, Bo, you went off of mute.
Nope, no question here. Thanks.
Okay, sir, misinterpreted a little change there. And we're getting a question, and Deborah Lucero, did you have a question?
Oh, I just wondered, I'm wondering about the interbasin coordination meetings, when those will be opened up to the public. As I know, I've already told you, Tanya, I had a hydrologist, an agriculturalist, and an environmentalist who would be interested in those discussions, particularly as they relate to some of those issues along the Sac River corridor.
Yes, and this is one of the important questions that we're asking at this point, Supervisor Lucero, because these conversations have been happening at the staff level, and then the staff decides when they'd like to bring in their consultants to the conversation, and it's happening between and among 11 subbasins. You know, we bring up the question, right, about what are opportunities to bring in the public and how might we want to do that? And I think that given the diversity of these different subbasins and that they have, you know, GSAs with their own jurisdiction, you know, we're going to continue to ask that question. We're going to have another staff meeting related to interbasin coordination next week. This very question that you're asking is on the agenda. And I can imagine that I don't want to get ahead of them because I'm not a decider, right? That it may look differently in different subbasins, right? There might, you know, in terms of how the public is brought into these discussions. So it's the question has been heard, and we're relaying it, and we're facilitating discussions to figure out how the public can have even more visibility and provide input into these interbasin coordination discussions. As you know, for the time being, Butte County is hosting an interbasin coordination website. We provide you with the agendas and the meeting summaries from those staff level conversations, and we always welcome your follow-up with us if you have questions about anything that you may have seen in those summaries. And really, that's the best that I can do now as the facilitator who does not decide these things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Lucero. Okay, so we have just a minute before we're at the top of the hour, and I'd just like to open it up to the GSAs and maybe the GSA managers or BAB members who might have quick updates that you'd like to share that are important to provide in this venue. Any updates from the GSAs, the 11 GSAs here? Okay, I'm not seeing any. We are at 3 o'clock. We always like to get input on what these meeting experiences have been like for you. I don't know, Mariana, do we have a poll to just launch for the group, or are we just going to ask folks to provide us with input offline, given that it's 3 o'clock?
Yes, we don't have a poll for it right now. I also wanted to point people to the fact sheet that we developed after it was requested at the last BAT meeting. We've developed a fact sheet so you can share with your stakeholders to describe Sigma, and we welcome input and feedback as well in writing.
Yes, you'll remember, thank you for mentioning that, Mariana. We included it in the packet of information. And at the December 14th meeting, we had a good conversation with the advisory board members. Thank you for sharing that. The advisory board members about different ways that we could help support you in your respective outreach efforts and then for the subbasins outreach efforts. And one of the things that there was high level of agreement about was it would be nice to be able to just have some sort of flyer that you could send around to your constituents and stakeholders. So we have developed that. And we might think about other similar sort of fact sheets or FAQs that could support these technical discussions and really help build public understanding. And so ideas that you might have about that, you can always be in touch with CBI, and we'll make sure to continue the conversation with the GSA managers at our next meeting about the best ways that we can provide outreach and materials to support this effort. Okay, any final word? Now that we're just after 3 o'clock, anything else from the GSAs or members of the public before we wrap it up today? Thank you so much for your participation. We appreciate your time and effort, and we look forward to being in touch with you. Please always feel free to be in touch with us. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day. Byron, are you there?